Hi, for this activity, you are going to listen to more information about traveling in covered wagon. We're going to look at some diagrams and talk about what it was like to ride on those. After this, you are going to complete this paper that you should have in your little house stuff, moving then and now. And you're going to take a picture and show it to me. Also, there's a second activity that you should click on after we have you've watched the video, and that is called Labeling a Prairie Schooner. And complete that and send it to me, showing the different parts of the covered wagon that we're going to learn about in our book right now. There's a lot more to this book than what we need, because it is specifically about traveling in a covered wagon, and talks a lot about traveling on the Oregon Trail. And the Oregon Trail actually ran through the northern part of Missouri and all the way across Nebraska, Colorado, and Idaho, a little bit in Wyoming, and into Oregon. And then there was a second part of it that branched off and went down through Utah into California. Ma and Pa didn't travel actually on the Oregon Trail. They traveled by covered wagon, but they were headed in a different direction. So we're only going to read the parts of this book that have to do with Ma and Pa. So I'm going to go to what was a covered wagon, page 9. And that's going to show you some of the things that you would find in covered wagons. So it says a covered wagon was a wagon with a white rounded top made of cloth. The cloth was called canvas and was rubbed with oil to make it waterproof. Also made it smell. It was stretched over big wooden hoops that were bent from one side of the wagon to the other. There were drawstrings in the front and the back of the canvas. If you look at your book cover, you can see that in the back where Mary and Laura are sitting. If you pull the strings tight, you could close the ends up to keep out the rain or the wind. The canvas could also be rolled up on the long sides so that you would get a breeze on a hot day. The bottom part of the covered wagon looked like an ordinary wagon with one difference. The front wheels were smaller than the back wheels, and that made it easier to make sharp turns. Inside the wagon, there were hooks on the wooden hoops. On them, you could hang milk cans, guns, bonnets, spoons, dolls, jackets, and anything else that there was room for. So here in this picture, you can definitely see how the front wheels are smaller than the back. You can also see that this one is being pulled by oxen. Pa used horses, Mustangs. If you were going all the way across the Oregon Trail from one end to the other, you usually used oxen instead of horses because they were stronger and they lasted longer. Underneath the wagon, between the back wheels, there was a hook with a bucket full of grease hanging down from it. You see it? Right back there, right there. And that grease was rubbed on the wheels so that they would turn smoothly. In the front of the wagon, there was a wooden board to sit on, and that was described in our book as well. They called it the wagon seat. The covered wagon was pulled by oxen or mules or horses. Many pioneers used oxen because they were stronger than mules and horses. Covered wagons were also called prairie schooners. Can you guess why? Do they kind of look like boats going off across the prairie? Remember I told you that the grasses could be up to 6 feet tall? So they kind of look like boats. A schooner is a boat that sails on the seas. The big white canvas cover on the wagon looked like a huge sail. And if the grass was tall enough to hide the wheels, the wagon looked like a big boat sailing across the grassy green waves. All right, let's go on to another part. We don't need trail guides or wagon trains because they kind of traveled on their own. Okay, I'm going to go to what would your family bring in their covered wagon? You guys made some guesses. Some of you were right. Some of you had some odd ideas, but as much as you could pack in is what you would bring. It was necessary to leave behind everything that you didn't really need, especially if it was heavy. Anything that you could make or build when you get there, as far as furniture was concerned, you would have left behind. The oxen and the horses pulling the wagons had a hard time just walking across the country. If the wagons were too heavy, the oxen could die from exhaustion. It was very important to try to figure out how much food you would need for the 5 or 6 months you would be traveling. There was no supermarket you could go to when you ran out of supplies, so you would bring flour and yeast for baking bread. Your family would also bring crackers, cornmeal, bacon, eggs, dried meat, and dried fruit, potatoes, rice, beans, and a big barrel of water, which would have weighed a lot. They might even have some chocolate for special treats, only if they were very wealthy pioneers. Um, Thankfully, Pa is an unbelievable carpenter. So their family brought almost no, I don't think they brought any furniture with them, and he will build everything that they need when they get there. So there was a lot of supplies in their wagon, and that was probably about it. They were also not the wealthiest family, and so they had what they could afford as far as food and things. And they were traveling through land that would have had houses, not houses, but stores they could have stopped at and done some trading at. So they didn't need as many supplies as people that were heading out over the Oregon Trail on land that no one had, no towns were on. If your family had cows, you might bring them along for milk and meat. Your family also knew that they would be able to hunt on for more meat on the trail, and they would find wild berries and honey and some vegetables along the way. Pioneers, of course, made their own clothing, so your family brought along cloth to sew with, needles, thread, pins, and scissors, and leather to fix worn-out shoes. You imagine having to fix your own shoes? You had to make your own repairs, so you brought saws and hammers, axes, nails, string, and knives. For daily chores, you would bring things like soap, wax for making candles, lanterns, and wash bowls. Okay, and then you'll see here this little girl is looking inside of a box. It's actually part of the wagon. There's the wagon cover up there, and it pulls out and it's got different stuff in it. And that was called a journey or a Johnny box. And many covered wagons had those at the back of the wagon above the grease bucket, so that they could store things in. Some people stored tools. This one looks like it's got kitchen supplies in it. So it was just different things, but that's called a Johnny or a Journey box. Many people brought tents to sleep in outside the wagons. If they hunted buffalo on the trail, they would often use the skins for making blankets. With the fur on the inside, a buffalo skin was very warm and soft. It was also important not to forget medicines in case somebody got sick on the trip. There weren't a lot of medicines that were available, so you probably wouldn't have had very much. You might have had bandages. And many pioneer women knew a lot about the plants knew a lot about plants and how those helped to make people feel better. Nobody forgot plates, knives, forks, spoons, cups. Oh, there's an ant on me. There we go. And pots and pans. They were kept in a special box attached to the back of the wagon, called a Johnny or a Journey box. Most people started in the spring, just like Ma and Pa did, but if you had to go across certain areas, you started earlier, like the end of February, before you would have ice break up and the big rivers you couldn't get across. And that was, and then you would have to ford them. How far could you travel in a day? Well, on many days you would travel only 10 to 15 miles. If it was muddy and raining hard, you might make 1 mile in a whole day. So going was really slow. So Laura and Mary and Ma and Pa and baby Carrie and Jack traveled from Wisconsin all the way to Kansas, which is hundreds of miles. And it would have taken them months. When they get to the prairie, to where we're at in chapter 5, and they're starting to build, it's in June, the beginning of summer. So they've traveled for 3 months to get there during times. And we read about how the wagon got stuck in the mud and they had to wait for the mud to dry so Paul could get it out. Today, if you are driving in a car on the highway, you usually travel 65 miles in an hour. In a covered wagon, it might take you 5 or 6 or even 7 days to go as far as you can go today in 1 hour. You would usually have to get up very early to start traveling in the wagons. Most people got up around 4 o'clock in the morning when it was still dark. Wow. First, they would start the fire so that they could cook breakfast. Then they would round up the cattle and start to load up their wagons with the tents, blankets, pots, and pans. The wagons would start moving by 7 o'clock in the morning and they would travel until lunchtime. Then you would rest for an hour or two, and after lunch you would travel again until about 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 o'clock at night, and finally you would stop until the next day. So, not very far. Would you ride in the wagon for the whole trip? Now, you remember Laura got really tired of being in the wagon, and Ma said she could not get out and walk. And I don't think that it doesn't sound like Ma let them do much of that, but actually, people did. Um, in matter of fact, the answer to the question, would you ride in the wagon for the whole trip, is no. In fact, you probably wouldn't ride for even most of the way. If you ever had a chance to ride in a covered wagon for more than an hour, you would know why. They are super narrow. They are super small. They are really, really uncomfortable. They are bumpy. There was no smooth highways or roads back in the 1800s, and sometimes you made your own trail, as they did at the very end when they came towards their house. So, being the first wagon to go over a piece of ground, other times you rode in the ruts made by other wagon wheels. You could feel every bump when you sat in the wagon. There was no cushioned seats, just wooden boards covered with a few blankets. Much of the time you would walk next to the wagon. The wagons traveled very slowly so you could easily keep up with them. When your feet got very tired, then you might climb up and ride for a while, and sometimes you might want to ride in the wagon just to get the view from high up. The drivers would even often walk alongside the oxen. They didn't use reins. They would shout and sometimes use a whip, but you wouldn't hit the animals. You would just crack the whip over their heads to make them go the way you wanted to. So, Ma not letting them walk was kind of unusual. I think it had to do with the fact that they were pretty small and very young, Laura and Mary were, when they traveled. Where would you sleep? We learned that the girls slept in the wagon, but Ma and Pa slept in a tent outside. Or some people just slept on the ground. And we know about the clothes, and we know somewhat about what they would eat. Okay. And we know how Pa built a fire, so we don't need to watch any of that or read anything about that. What chores would you have to do? And this was on the wagon trail, as well as if you were homesteading. And these are children that are your age, 8 and 9, 10 and 11. They were considered plenty old enough to do jobs. So everybody worked very hard during the long days of traveling. Children had lots of things to do. They milked cows if they had cows and fetched water from the river. They watched the cattle when they walked behind the wagons and helped cook the food and wash the dishes and helped skin and prepare the buffalo or deer or wild turkey when they were caught, and collected wood or buffalo chips in baskets to help make the fire, and shook out the blankets and the quilts in the fresh air, and hung the beef jerky to dry. And you'll remember Mary and Laura were also doing a lot of those things that you heard about in the book. Some of it was hard work, some of it was easy, but most of the chores were interesting because instead of living in a house, you were living in a covered wagon, and things had to be done in new and different ways. Many times there was music. Pa plays the fiddle. People also played harmonica on the trips. They celebrated the 4th of July. That was a big, big, big holiday back there. Let's see. And there's a lot about driving over mountains and things in here, but Mom and Pa didn't do that, so I'm not going to read that part. Um, how do we know what it was like to travel in a covered wagon? Well, we have tons of diaries that pioneers wrote when they were traveling. You wrote a diary entry this week, and there's just lots and lots of them about what it was like to live and travel on those. This book is called If You Traveled West in a Covered Wagon. If you'd like to read the whole thing, you could look it up and see if it's on YouTube. I haven't checked. I know there's some other really good books about covered wagons. One is mentioned in the activity, Labeling the Prairie Schooner, that you could go and listen to, be read to you on YouTube, and it would tell you more about the covered wagon as well. So have fun finding out about covered wagons. All right. So on your own, now that we've read the first 5 chapters of Little House on the Prairie, and we know what it was like for them to travel in a covered wagon and move from one state to another, and we've read more about the covered wagon and what people took in it and how they traveled on the trails, it is time for you to do a comparison activity. So you're going to take this paper, moving, then, and now, and you are going to tell how these things that Laura and Mary experienced back in the 1800s would be different today. For example, number 1 says the family didn't know exactly where they were headed and had to build their own home when they got there. So if we were moving today, how would that be different? Well, that would be that we would know exactly the address of our new home because we had purchased it. Even if it was in another state, we would have directions to it, probably on our phones. And when we got there, we would just move into the house. We wouldn't have to build our own house. So you're going to tell us how moving today was different from moving back then. If you get stuck on one, I'm sure that you could ask Mom or Dad or your older brother or sister, if you have one, for some ideas, but I bet you don't need them. Remember to take a picture of that and post it so I can see that you did it. That paper will be turned in with your stack of turn-in stuff on April 17th.